Hello everyone, it's Daniel from TechMindFactory and welcome to this next video from the series called Implementing Secure Applications with Microsoft Azure. In this video, we are going to see how to deploy to Microsoft Azure Cloud from Azure DevOps with Workload Identity Federation. As always, let's start with the solution architecture diagram for this application. So basically in this video, we are going to focus on Azure DevOps and how to securely deploy to the Azure Cloud from Azure DevOps. So this is the diagram which I would like to present. So we have Azure DevOps on the left side and we have Azure Cloud on the right side. And obviously in Azure DevOps, we have our Git repository with the source code for Azure infrastructure, our application, and also we have deployment pipelines to deploy Azure infrastructure, to deploy application packages to the Azure Cloud. And on the right side, we have Azure Cloud resources. So we have different kinds of resource groups. Inside those resource groups, we have different kinds of Azure resources like Azure Web Apps, Azure Containers Apps, and so on and so forth. And the thing is that Azure DevOps must authenticate and has permissions granted to deploy to Azure subscriptions and the resource groups. So it means that we cannot just, deploy magically to Azure Cloud. We have to set up this secure connection between Azure DevOps and the Azure Cloud. And in the past, before Workload Identity Federation was in place, we used this approach. So basically, we had to create app registration with service principal, and we had to use application secret. Okay? And the downside of this approach was that using a secret requires manual rotation and management, and it's not recommended. So Workload Identity Federation is the preferred credential type. And as you probably know, the problem with secrets is that they expire, and also we have to rotate them. We have to, take care of this replacement for the new secrets and so on and so forth. So that could be tricky. So actually in the past, we were creating service principal. We were grabbing client ID, client secret, tenant ID. We were storing those values in the Azure DevOps. And at some point in the future, we had to make sure that if secret is expired in Microsoft Entra ID, actually, which is used to secure access to Azure subscriptions, we will be able to replace the secret with the new one. So actually, it's not like a convenient way of doing things. And also from the security perspective, it's not the best option. So that's why we have Workload Identity Federation in place. So this is the new recommended approach where we use app registration or manage identity, and we use Workload Identity Federation. Okay, and in this video, we are going to discuss both approaches. So using Workload Identity Federation with app registration, with manage identity, and then we will see how to securely deploy to the Azure Cloud. Okay, so before we even jump into the Azure DevOps and source code, it's worth to explain what Workload Identity Federation is. So Workload Identity Federation is a cloud authentication approach that allows applications or workloads to access cloud resources securely without needing to store or manage traditional credentials like passwords, API keys, certificates, secrets, whatever it was. Instead, it relies on identity tokens that are dynamically issued by identity providers like GitHub Identity Management, Google Cloud, Entra ID, and trusted by target cloud environment like the Azure Cloud. Okay? And when it comes to Workload Identity Federation with Azure DevOps, it allows release pipelines to securely access Azure resources in the cloud without the need for stored credentials such as service principal secrets or certificates. So instead, Azure DevOps can authenticate using a token-based mechanism directly with Microsoft Entra ID, which is used to secure Azure resources. So the thing is, just to summarize it and make it simple, with Workload Identity Federation, we can eliminate the need of using any secrets on Azure DevOps side and we will reduce this problem with expiring secrets. And also with Workload Identity Federation, we'll make our solution more secure, because in this way we can securely deploy to the Azure cloud without storing any secrets. Okay, it's worth to explain what's happening underneath when it comes to Workload Identity Federation. So that's why I prepared this slide to make sure that we will be able to understand what's going on here. So basically, we have release pipelines in the Azure DevOps. We have Microsoft Entra ID, which is used to protect our Azure resources. And obviously, we have OpenID Connect, a protocol in place here used to make the token exchange. So let's actually talk about this flow really quickly so we understand what's happening underneath when Azure DevOps is trying to deploy resources to the Azure cloud using Workload Identity Federation. So release pipeline is requesting a token from Azure DevOps, okay? So Azure DevOps can issue its own token. So it's issuing the token for the release pipeline, so release pipeline can execute specific steps. However, one of those steps is to deploy resources to the Azure cloud. So release pipeline is exchanging Azure DevOps token for the access token from Microsoft Entra ID, which is actually Microsoft Entra ID is used to secure Azure cloud resources, okay? So we obtain the Azure DevOps token, we go to Microsoft Entra ID, and we are exchanging the token for the access token in Entra. And what is happening then is this. Microsoft Entra ID is checking the trust relationship, including validation of external token, against the OpenID Connect issuer URL, okay? So in this case, Microsoft Entra ID is validating this token that was received from a release pipeline that was issued by Azure DevOps. And now, if this token is valid, if basically there is this trust relationship in place that we will see in this video, Microsoft Entra ID will issue an access token to the release pipeline in Azure DevOps. And then the release pipeline in Azure DevOps can securely access Azure resources using this access token. And the thing is that obviously when we say access token, there are specific, like scopes in this access token. And in the end, the thing is that we can decide what can be done in Azure Cloud from the release pipeline in Azure DevOps. And that's what we will see in this video. So for instance, we can allow release pipeline to create Azure infrastructure in a specific resource group. We can allow release pipeline to only create resources in a specific resource group, or we can allow resource pipeline to, update specific services in the Azure cloud. Okay, so now important thing is that when we configure Workload Identity Federation in the Azure cloud, we have actually two options to configure it, okay? That's very important. So we can either use app registration approach, or we can use manage identity. And this is very important. This is what you will also see when you will configure new service connection in the Azure DevOps. So under this identity type, you will see that you can select app registration automatic or manage identity. So let me explain this actually to avoid some confusion here. So you can configure app registration with Workload Identity Federation with federated credential if you are the owner of the Azure subscription. Okay, so if you are the owner of Azure subscription, that's great. That's the first thing, indicates that you can probably use app registration. You are not connecting to Azure Stack or Azure US government environments. Okay, so if you use Azure Public Cloud, you're good to go with app registration. And the last important thing is that you have the permission to create app registrations in Microsoft Entra ID tenant. So if you are the owner of the Azure subscription, if you use public cloud, and if you can create app registrations in Microsoft Entra ID, you can use app registration approach with Workload Identity Federation. However, sometimes we have, another approach where we cannot create app registrations in Microsoft Entra ID. We are not the owner of the Azure subscription. So this is typically the scenario where there is like a company working with consultancy company or professional services company, and like the company would like to provide only access to specific resource groups for this consulting or professional services company. So in this case, maybe it's better approach to use managed identity. So you can use managed identity when you are not the owner of Azure subscription. You have existing user-assigned managed identity to use, like the one created by Azure subscription owner for you. And also, you cannot create app registrations in Microsoft Entra ID. So basically, if you cannot create app registrations in Entra ID, you are not the owner of Azure subscription, you can ask administrator to create user-assigned managed identity for you inside specific resource group, let's say, and you will have permissions to deploy to this resource group with this managed identity from Azure DevOps. So actually, like you have those two approaches here. Which one works best for you? It's something to be considered by you. I'm just presenting those two options, so please remember about them. Okay, so now let's explain this, okay? This is very important because in this specific scenario, we are going to talk about user-assigned managed identity. I will also present this scenario, but basically for both methods like app registration and managed identity, it works in the same way. So when it comes to Azure DevOps, we create user-assigned managed identity with RBAC roles assigned in the Azure cloud, okay? So let's say that in the resource group in the Azure cloud, we created user-assigned managed identity. For this user-assigned managed identity, we configure Workload Identity Federation or Federated credential to be more precise. And also we assign RBAC roles to this specific managed identity. So for instance, we grant contributor role to this managed identity to make it possible for this managed identity to deploy resources to this resource group from Azure DevOps, okay? So in this specific scenario, another way to do it, we have application registered in Microsoft Entra ID, again with RBAC role or roles assigned, and we can then securely deploy to the Azure cloud. So basically, the configuration is exactly the same. So it's your decision whether to use app registration or whether to use user-assigned managed identity. It depends on the level of permissions. If you can create app registrations in Entra, if you are the owner of Azure subscription, probably application registration is the way to go. If you have limited permissions, you are not the owner of Azure subscription, you cannot create app registrations in Entra, user-assigned managed identity can be a better solution for you. Okay, so now it's time to see it in action. Okay, so let's start in the Azure portal. So as I mentioned, we have two options to configure Workload Identity Federation using app registration or managed identity. So let me start with app registration here. So I'm in Microsoft Entra ID, which is secure, which is used to secure my Azure resources. From the left side, I have app registrations tab. I click new app registration, and here I can provide the name for this app registration. Okay, so in this case, I will call it Secure Cloud App DevOps, like this, and I will click register button. Okay, so in this specific scenario, app registration along with service principal is created for me in the Azure portal. When you create this in Azure portal, both will be created for you, app registration and service principal. Okay, so now to configure Workload Identity Federation, we have to open certificates and secrets, and here is the section called Federated Credentials. So this is the place where we can configure Workload Identity Federation actually. So we click Add Credential, and from the list, we have to select the scenario. So as you can see, there are different kinds of scenarios. It can be customer managed keys, GitHub Actions deploying Azure resources, Kubernetes, other issuer. So basically, to configure this with Azure DevOps, we have to select other issuer. If you work with GitHub, you can use GitHub Actions here. So it works pretty the same. So I will select other issuer, and as you can see here, I have to provide the issuer and the subject identifier, okay? And I have to provide the name for this credential and optionally description, and audience is filled out for me. So in a minute, I will show you how I configured this for my environment. But the thing is that the value of the issuer and subject identifier, those values will be taken from Azure DevOps, okay? And I will explain what's happening here in a minute. but this was example for the app registration. But also in my solution architecture, I decided to use user assigned managed identity. So as you can see here, I have this user assigned managed identity created in this resource group. Let me open this. So when I open this user assigned managed identity, as you remember, I mentioned that this is the second method that you can use to set up Workload Identity Federation. So with user assigned managed identity, as you can see under the settings, I have this section called Federated Credentials. Okay, and here, as you can see, I can click Add Credential, and we will see exactly the same tab as we saw in app registration. So we can configure it for GitHub Actions, Kubernetes, Other. And if I click here, you can see that I have exactly the same tab and things here. Okay. So from this point, I will focus on user assigned managed identity method, but the things I will show you work exactly the same for app registration. Okay. So let me close this because actually I have configured my credential for Azure DevOps. Okay, so let me open this. So as you can see here, I selected configure identity managed by external OpenID Connect provider. So the third option here. And I provided the issuer URL here. This is from Azure DevOps. And also subject identifier is also from Azure DevOps, which I will show you. Okay, so those values have to be taken from Azure DevOps. And under credential details, we have the name of the credential and the audience. So obviously those are set automatically. I can edit this, but I will keep it as it is for now. So actually issuer URL and subject identifier, those two values are crucial here. Okay, so let's see how to grab those values here. So let me open Azure DevOps here. Here is Cloud Identity Security Project in Azure DevOps. And under project settings, here when I will open it, we will see that actually I can configure service connections. So this is the place where I can configure this connection to the Azure Cloud. Okay, so I'm clicking service connections. And as you can see, I've already created a connection for my dev environment. However, when I click new service connection, and I will select Azure Resource Manager and click Next, you can see that those are the options I mentioned to you. App registration and manage identity, okay? And obviously you can use automatic option, you can use manual option. I prefer to use manual option because then I understand what's happening in my Azure subscription and in Azure DevOps. So I selected manage identity and I created this service connection, and let me show you what's happening here. Obviously, I have to provide the name of this service connection, description. So this service connection enables deployment of secure cloud app resources on dev environment. And when I scroll down, obviously here I have the subscription ID, subscription name. However, as you can see under application client ID and the directory ID here, I have to fill out those details. So now, let's check this application ID. So this application ID, when I get back to my managed identity, as you can see, this is the client ID of my managed identity. This is very important. So under Overview tab, I have my client ID. I have to fill it out here in Azure DevOps. Directory tenant ID is actually my Microsoft Azure ID tenant value. And as you can see here, I have the issuer and subject identifier values here displayed for me in this tab. So I can copy issuer and I can paste it under my federated credential. So here under issuer URL, I'm pasting this value, and under the issuer subject identifier, I'm pasting this value from Azure DevOps. Okay. And now, when I paste those values, I can click Save or Update, and my federated credential will be created here. And also, here I will be able to save changes. However, one important thing. Before you will do it, actually, please make sure that this managed identity or app registration, depending on the method you choose, be sure that you assign RBAC roles. So let me get back to my resource group. As you can see, here is my resource group with all the resources. And let's say that I would like to deploy those resources to this specific resource group from Azure DevOps. So actually, configuring Workload Identity Federation is one thing. However, I have to also assign RBAC roles. So I will click Access Control for this resource group. And here I can select Add Role Assignment. And please note that here, for instance, I can select Contributor Role. I can click Next. And depending on the method you choose, you can either select User Group or Service Principal if you use app registration, or you can select Manage Identity. That's my solution actually. So in this case, I'm selecting Members, User Assigned Manage Identity, and as you can see here, I have this Manage Identity that I use here. I select it, and then I can click Review and Assign. And in this case, I will assign contributor role to this Manage Identity, and then I will be able to, for instance, successfully create resources in this resource group and deploy packages with my application to this resource group. So that's how it works actually. So as I mentioned, you have two options to configure Workload Identity Federation, either with app registration or with the user assigned managed identity. So now when you configure everything in Azure DevOps and your service connection is in place, actually, when you go to pipelines, let me show you that. I have my pipelines here, as you can see. Let me open one of those pipelines here. So I will switch here to Secure Cloud Application. Okay, perfect. And let's say that I want to deploy my web application to Azure Cloud. Okay, so as you can see, I'm using templates in Azure DevOps. I have different kinds of jobs. So I have this deploy web application job. And as you can see, I don't have any secrets here actually. I have only reference to Azure connection name, where I'm providing the name of a service connection I created. And that's it. I don't have to store any secrets in Azure DevOps. I'm just referencing this service connection I created in Azure DevOps under project settings. And then I can securely deploy to the Azure cloud without using any secrets. That's it for this video. I hope you found it interesting and helpful. And that was actually the last video in this series. So I hope you enjoyed the whole series, and thank you so much for watching.